Welcome back. His name is Balarama Holness, and he has defied the odds. A man who wasn't typically built for football, but ended up winning a Grey Cup. A high school dropout who is just completing his 5th degree, this time in law. And now Balarama has his eye on politics as the nation tackles some difficult questions about racial inequality in Canada.
We are at the forefront of a national reckoning on race. I have been disenchanted with how these protests do not equate to concrete change. How can this guarantee change? It's through the halls of power. It's through using law to force our country to deal with issues of racism.
You might not know the name Balarama Holness yet, but this 37-year-old Montrealer with Jamaican Quebecois roots is getting attention. A Grey Cup winning defensive back, a scholar with 5 degrees, a political activist who forced a dialogue on systemic racism, and a man who's making headlines in the United States. Balarama, when you wake up in the morning and you see the activist striving to be the Canadian Obama in the New York Times,
Yeah.
what does that feel like?
Well, first things first, I am no Canadian Obama. I am the Balarama Holness of Quebec, of Canada.
And yet there are obvious parallels. A young man who's a lawyer, who's on this political track. You've made the correlation between you and Obama. Why is that? Well,
Obama made his mark really as a community organizer, and I think that is where I connected with Obama's story.
After the police killing of George Floyd in the U.S., voices around the world could no longer be silenced, including here in Canada. And yet the biggest players in Quebec politics still refuse to admit that systemic racism exists. While in law school at McGill, Balarama set up an organization called Montreal in Action to force them to look closer. We're sitting in a city, in a province that has really struggled with even identifying or acknowledging the fact that systemic racism exists.
Yes.
You decide that you're going to use your brain for law and find a way to force the conversation.
I decide through the right of initiative, a clause in the Montreal Charter, that I am going to force a public consultation on systemic racism.
Because you found in the law that if you get a certain number of names on a petition,
Yes.
they have to hold
Yes.
a hearing.
In this case, it was 15,000 handwritten signatures.
So you set to work.
We put the wheels in the road, pedal to the metal, and for 90 days, my team and I, Montreal in Action, were in the streets, collecting signatures to force this public consultation. Bon compte. No longer will Montrealers tolerate racial profiling, employment discrimination, housing discrimination.
What was that like for you at City Hall, holding on to all of these signatures?
Proud, joy, elation. We force an all-white executive committee to mandate a public consultation. We legally oblige them.
And that public consultation came out with some very damning findings.
When the report came out and said, not only does it exist and you're turning a blind eye to it, it's happening throughout public life here in Montreal.
In June of 2020, after 18 months of hearings, Montreal's mayor, Valérie Plante, finally acknowledged the existence of systemic racism.
Collective awakening that systemic racism does exist.
Along with 38 recommendations, the report forced Montreal's police service to change the way street checks are performed. They now say they will stop people on observable facts and not skin color. It's a major shift after years of resisting reform and accusations of racial profiling.
So we feel empowered because we're on the right side of history.
Balarama Holness's path to becoming an activist, lawyer, and aspiring politician has been an unusual one.
My mother is Quebecois, blonde hair, blue eyes, and she meets my father, who is a Jamaican man from St. Elizabeth, Jamaica, the countryside, and they meet in 1979 at the Forum of Montreal at a Bob Marley concert. How romantic.
Darkness has covered my life.
That romance turned to marriage and twins, Balarama and his brother Jagannatha. The young family packed up and moved to an ashram, a Hindu spiritual retreat in the US, where they lived for 10 years.
You've had an extraordinarily unorthodox upbringing.
Yes.
What are your memories of that time?
I remember swinging on vines in the rolling hills of West Virginia, swimming in creeks, and waking up every morning and meditating, praying, learning to sit in stillness.
What was the transition like for you from this ashram where you're living this very idyllic life, being transplanted into a rough neighborhood here in Montreal?
It's a culture shock. Moving from the ashram to the material world, as we call it, is a huge culture shock. This is the first school that I attended when I came from the ashram. It's just incredible to see this school. I was in a welcome class, and it's people from all over the world, from Lebanon, from the Philippines, from all over Africa. As soon as I stepped out of that class and into more homogenous spaces is when I started to feel a backlash about my name, my identity.
Didn't your teacher give you a different name?
Yes. One of my teachers attempted to, what I call, give me a white name, and he called me Stephen. Later on in life, I found out that Nelson Mandela had the same experience. Nelson is not his real name. Barry Obama, Barry is not his real name. So the school, in an odd way, became a way to whitewash people or to assimilate people. And in the classroom, for the first time, a young boy by the name of Francois calls me the N-word. And now it's affirming that I am really outside the scope of what is accepted in society.
Everybody remembers the first time they were called that word. What kind of emotion did that invoke in you?
A fist fight.
Anger.
Anger. And from that point on, fighting became a way that I dealt with a lot of these issues.
Balarama's childhood had challenges. His parents split, and his father lived in social housing.
Despite the fact that we were poor, despite the fact that I was up to no good, my father always tried to keep me on the right track. And it is the values of education that my father instilled in me is the main reason why I'm in this seat today and a core reason why I'm able to impact my community. So my father is my anchor.
As a teenager, Balarama lost track of some of those values, and despite his dad's efforts, he derailed.
You were going down a path that could have led you in a much different direction.
Yes.
Of getting into trouble,
Yes.
of doing drugs.
In grade 9, for the first time of my life, I am presented with negative influences. There are people who are selling drugs, people who are taking drugs, and we go to a school that does not have a football team, does not have a track, there's no sports infrastructure, the science laboratory lacks resources, and I end up dropping out of high school. One evening, I am watching Monday Night Football, and I see a defensive back who is 5'11", 180 pounds, and looks like me. And I decide at that very moment, I can do that. There was a moment in my life where I made a decision that I was going to change routes, and I took it really seriously.
Now, Balarama engages with kids who are in the same headspace he was, a teenager seeking direction.
So What I did is I joined John Abbott Football and I started to play football, and everything changed. So football saved me. Le football m'a sauvé.
His is a fairy tale sports story. Balarama was recruited by Ottawa University and trained on the track and football field. Despite his late start, his combination of speed and strength took him all the way to the CFL, where he played as a defensive back for 3 seasons.
The Winnipeg Blue Bombers may have just stuck the nail in the coffin of the Toronto Argonauts playoff hopes.
And the 98 Grey Cup is underway.
And in 2010, he wore a hometown jersey with the Montreal Alouettes. They made the Grey Cup final and won.
Yeah, baby! Yeah, baby!
Do you have a natural talent for football? Did it just come like this for you?
My father was one of the fastest men in Jamaica of his time. So our Jamaican speed genetics are quite advanced, for lack of a better term. So football was something that came natural, and all that energy, that pent-up energy I had when I was in the streets with my friends, I could translate in a cathartic way to the football field.
But Balarama knew that success on the football field would be fleeting, and his father's teachings about the power of education led him back to the classroom.
When did you realize that education was going to be your savior?
Yeah, I noticed that people of color were not included in the curriculum. And I wondered, why is it that the prison population is overrepresented with people that look like me? Why is it that people who look like me are associated with criminality? Why is it that city halls and Parliament, the Senate, the House of Commons are not representative of Canada? I just asked myself, why is it that visible minorities are at the basement of society? And I come to a conclusion, is that education was going to be my shield and my sword to protect myself.
Oh my God, I am so happy right now. I just got an email from McGill Law and I've been accepted.
In 2017, Balarama began a double law degree after already completing a master's in education.
Making the decision to be great is the first step.
These kids may be inspired by his prowess on the football field, but Balarama has a more important message.
For me, my muscles in society was the more education I can get, the more power I can get. The better you do in school, the more power you get.
Coming up, confronting systemic racism on home turf.
The act on Giuliano Gray was brutality. Montrealers were enraged.
When W5 continues.
Protests against police brutality have forced a reckoning on racism around the world. It's a reality that Montrealers know well. They're seeking justice for names like Bonnie Jean-Pierre, who was shot dead in 2016 by a police officer who's now on trial. For the Indigenous mother of 7, Joyce Echequan, who recorded her mistreatment in a Montreal hospital before dying there. And for what happened on this metro platform in 2019. 21-year-old Giuliano Gray was beaten by transit security over an unpaid subway fare.
The act on Giuliano Gray was brutality. Montrealers were enraged. Giuliano Gray couldn't walk for weeks, had to go to the hospital. So for us, we've become numb to brutality. We've become numb to profiling. And it's going to take new leadership in order to remedy many of these issues.
Balarama Holness wants to be that leader. A once high school dropout, Balarama muscled his way into the CFL and onto the Grey Cup winning Montreal Alouettes in 2010. He then embraced academics, first becoming a teacher and now a lawyer. With his partner and new daughter at his side, the 37-year-old is forcing a conversation in this country about systemic racism.
Canadians have been accused of a certain amount of smugness when it comes to race, that we
Yeah.
don't have the problems that our
Yeah.
big neighbor to the south does.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, we do not need the United States of America to have a conversation about systemic racism right here in Canada. We have our own issues where our prisons are overrepresentative of visible minorities. Unemployment rates for minority communities are double, if not triple, than the national average. The gap between the rich and the poor is expanding along racial lines. A report came out that established that Black and Arabs were 4 to 5 times more likely to be intercepted by police officers. That Indigenous women were 11 times more likely to be intercepted by police officers.
Defunding the police is something we hear again and
Yes.
again. Do you believe the police need to be defunded?
We're not defunding the police. We are reallocating funds to infrastructure, to social services, to ensure that we are hitting the root cause of the issue. Here in Quebec, we have the highest high school dropout rate in the whole nation. We pay our teachers the less out of anyone in the whole nation. So investing in teacher salaries, investing in sports infrastructure around schools, reforming the curriculum is better public security than funding a police officer.
Balarama's drive for change isn't just academic, it's personal.
You've had all these epiphanies that have led you to where you are right now, and yet you have a twin brother
Yeah.
who had the same upbringing as you, who has a much different life.
Yes. He's faster than me. He has better grades than me. He gets into physical education at McGill. Unfortunately, mental health ended up having a huge impact on his life. And it had a huge impact on issues of housing, issues of employment.
What's that like for you? I mean, the connection between twins is so known, and to know that your brother is on the street and you're in the New York Times.
I don't compare myself to my brother like that, but it is very painful, a lot of tears. You know, I'd visit him at the hospital and going back home, crying in the back of the bus. It's devastating. There's nothing you can do about it.
Statistics show that people of color and the mentally ill are more likely to have negative, even deadly interactions with police.
When we know, as a Black man with mental illness, it's dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why people are asking to defund the police. You do not need police officers with guns and badges to intercept people with mental health disorders. It kills people.
Balarama lives in the downtown core of Montreal, just blocks away from where he grew up. Most weekends he plays basketball with friends, many of whom he's had since those high school days when he veered off track and dropped out. While it's a game on the court, these friends are Balarama's sounding board.
What it means to be Quebecer does not mean to be French and white.
But how do you make that, like right now?
You run for office, dog. You run for office and you say, listen, I am Quebecer, I'm half Jamaican, I'm half Canadian, and I'm running for mayor of Montreal, and so can you. People like me could also govern this city, this province, and this state.
Balarama has his eye on the mayor's office in Montreal, where 33% of voters are visible minorities. Putting his name on the ballot is the first step. U.S. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris is being celebrated in Montreal. She received her high school education here at Westmount. The attention makes Balarama's prospects brighter in this city, but he knows there's a lot of history to unravel.
You have the mayor of Montreal celebrating Kamala Harris as the first woman of color elected as vice president. But in the whole history of Projet Montréal, not one woman of color was elected. At City Hall right now, there is not a single Black woman who is a city councilor.
Is there a concern that there's a lot of performative reaction to this upswell of demands for change?
That's the big issue. While the Prime Minister takes a knee, the question is this performative allyship? And people have yet to see the concrete action that follows. They do not see the changes.
Where do you see yourself in a decade?
In a decade? Well, it's interesting. In 2016, I put out a post and I said, I want to be a city councilor, I want to go to McGill Law, and I want to start a think tank. And 5 years later, I did that, but triple. I don't run for city councilor, I run for mayor. I don't have a think tank, I have Montreal in Action, a phenomenal organization that forced the city to have a consultation. And I get into McGill Law. So where I see myself in 10 years, I cannot predict. But one thing I do know is the best father I could be, a role model for my daughter to ensure that she is welcome and any other boy or girl in Canada is welcome and respected in society.
While Balarama looks forward to a bright future with his young family, in many ways it's that 1979 Bob Marley concert where his parents first met that drives him.
At that Bob Marley concert, it epitomizes the way that people can connect, regardless of their ethnicity, their skin tone, their religion, their language, and the fictitious divisions in society erase. And throughout my whole life, I've been chasing, in a way, that very same environment where we can all be respected and valued regardless of where we're from.
Balarama Holness plans to run for mayor of Montreal in 2021. Political leadership, after all, is in his blood. His cousin, Andrew Holness, is the Prime Minister of Jamaica.